Good morning, almost afternoon. Those two videos that Craig just showed are, as a former warden, why I sleep so much better at night now that I don't have to work in those conditions anymore. It's unbelievable the damage some of those guys can do in a cell with very little. All right. Okay. I want to talk to you about the mental health programming, because those of you who work in the jails, how many of you have mental health problems in your jails that are very difficult to deal with? Just about everyone. It's no different in the Department of Correction. We've managed over the years nationwide to have about 16% of our prison population that has some kind of a diagnosis, a mental health diagnosis. And when you combine that with substance abuse or substance use disorders, that number goes from 16% probably to around 85% of the inmates in our population have something going on, either with substance abuse, mental health, or both, combinations of all of those things, along with personality disorders and just about anything else you can think of. Sometimes it's very, very hard to try to fix something that never worked in the first place. And those of you who are in the construction business, you know that analogy rings true. It's very, very difficult. We're often given people that have been broken almost since the day that they were born, and we're asked to fix them. And that's a very, very difficult situation to be in. At the end of this program, I would like you to be able to have a better understanding of the proportion of the DOC offender population that I talked about, the types of mental health treatment that we provide in the DOC, the role and location of the DOC's mental health treatment units. We have 4 of them that we'll talk about. The function of the special needs acclimation programming units. Those are step-down transition type units that we have in our general populations for guys both coming out of mental health programs and for other individuals who might, because of a physical handicap or anything else that might put them on the fringe of the general population, kind of make them vulnerable. We'll also talk about how the adult disciplinary policy deals with offenders identified with mental illness, and how the IPAS lawsuit, the Indiana Protection Advocacy Services, actually filed a lawsuit about 7 years ago, and what we've done to work with them to kind of get a settlement out of that and get the things in place that they thought we needed to do. So we'll talk about all of those things. And I have a PowerPoint, but I probably won't stick very closely to it. So as I said, since the early 90s, more and more adults with serious mental illness have been involved in the criminal justice system. The Department of Correction nationwide and your county jails have become the #1 provider of mental health services. It's no longer state hospitals. It's no longer community mental health centers. The corrections business has become the #1 provider of mental health. Now that causes several problems because we were never designed. Prisons are not the environment that are ideal for providing somebody with a mental illness the treatment that they need and the treatment they deserve. So most of us run into physical plant issues. As I said, in the prisons and in the county jails, one of the first obstacles you run into is, okay, if we wanted to provide treatment, where would we do it? How many jails have treatment space? How many prisons have treatment space? Jails and prisons, although they're being designed differently now, most of the prisons throughout the state of Indiana are at least 30 years old, and some of them are as many as 160 years old. So finding space to do treatment is a big challenge. I know in the county systems with your limited budgets, even if you had the space, where do I get the money to pay for it? So that's another issue, and it's no different in the DOC. We struggle with all of those issues, and so what I will be talking a little bit about today is how we've tried to overcome that and trying to do the best that we can in the environment that we have and in the prisons we run. Department of Correction is, as I said, overcome a lot of barriers. In the last 5 years, we've created 4 inpatient mental health units in our prison system. These are not new structures, these are not new buildings. We've made space inside the prisons that we already had. With the help of Kevin Orm and his construction services, our treatment unit at Pendleton Correctional Facility is actually one of the only treatment units inside a prison where inmates don't live. They actually leave their cells and their buildings, their cell houses, and they walk to this treatment center, which used to be an old auto mechanic or a garage for cars that was completely gutted out and refurbished with inmate labor, and now it's a nice air-conditioned, temperature-controlled treatment center that our inmates can actually leave their cells, walk over to, and have appropriate space for our mental health professionals to provide group counseling and individual counseling as well. One of the other obstacles that we come across is the availability of mental health professionals. Psychologists and particularly psychiatrists are very short around the country. They're hard to come by. And because they're hard to come by, they can almost name their own whatever price they want. If you're lucky enough to get one that's willing to service, you're probably looking at several $100s an hour for a psychiatrist. I would encourage anybody in the design phase of building a new jail or a prison, I would encourage you to make sure that you have the availability for telehealth. Because with psychiatry in particularly, they deal with medication management. They aren't the ones who are on the front lines every day doing the psychotherapy and the groups, and those are their master's level people and the bachelor's level people. The psychiatrists are there to manage medication. So it's much easier to find a psychiatrist who might be a national type of person, might be in Arizona or might be in Montana. And if they have telehealth capabilities, that person might be willing to service your inmate if you have a place to bring that inmate down and put him in front of a camera. Because medication management a lot of times can be managed very effectively and efficiently that way. They're even doing a lot more of your medical services the same way through telehealth. So we have now made all of our facilities telehealth capable. Every single facility in the state that is minus the work camps. But every other facility in our state has at least a camera and a place where that camera can be secured, where we can bring an offender down, set him down, and he can talk to a psychiatrist if he's having medication issues or maybe he needs medication. The courts, however, have made it abundantly clear that correctional facilities are legally and constitutionally required to provide these services. So we are pinched because we can come up with every excuse we want. I don't have the space, I don't have the time, I don't have the money, I don't have the personnel. The courts don't care. Those are your problems, not the court's problems. And believe me, I've been told that in court. So you have to, come up with it, because otherwise you're going to be sued, just as sure as we're all sitting here. And the result of a court managing your mental health inside your jail can be a lot more harsh than you trying to figure out a way to manage it before it gets that far. All offenders housed in the DOC have access to mental health care, every single one, male and female. We have at least outpatient services at all of our facilities, And then, like I said, we have 4 facilities that actually have inpatient units for the people who are a little more mentally ill and having a little bit more difficulty adjusting to the environment. We don't go by diagnosis alone. So if you come in to the DOC and you have major depressive disorder or you have schizophrenia and you're on medication and you're stable and you're able to function, you're not going to go inside of an inpatient mental health unit. You're going to go to general population. You're going to have opportunity to have a job. You're going to have an opportunity to go to school, work a vocational, get a vocational trade. We base all of our placement decisions on functionality. So it doesn't matter what your diagnosis is, it's how well are you able to function in the general population. And it's those individuals who cannot function in the general population, those are the ones that we take out and we put them in our inpatient intensive treatment units. And the whole goal of those units is to return them, get them functional, and return them back to the general population, and eventually get them back to their community, because 99.9% of those guys are going to go back to their community. Just a little addition to that, in the last couple of years through the HIP 2.0 in Indiana, we've been able to make sure that every offender leaving the Department of Correction is signed up for HIP 2.0 and has some sort of insurance then that they can go back into the community with our help and setting it up before they leave. But we can make appointments, they can take a prescription with them, they can take, and they'll actually have some kind of insurance through HIP 2.0 that can help them get those services when they go back to the street. For years and years and years, we've done a pretty good job while they're in the prison, but then the day they get released, they go back out there and they have this medication that they need that's several $100s a month, and they need to see a psychiatrist every 60 or 90 days, which is another $300-400, and then it just stacks up. I mean, any of you who go to the doctor for any reason yourself just knows how expensive that is if you don't have insurance. So that's always been our downfall. We do a pretty good job and they do well while they're with us, but as soon as we return them to the street, they don't have the resources. So we're doing a lot more and more of that now. We're making sure that they have some coverage. We're making the appointments for them before they get out of prison so they know exactly where to go. They've already maybe talked to the person that they're going to meet with at the community mental health center. We're doing a lot of that stuff as part of our reentry programming now, just to go that extra step and trying to help them survive when they get out. So for those of you in the county jail, if you take just on the percentage of the national averages, if you have a county jail with 400 inmates, you can suspect between 40 and 50 of those guys are going to have a mental illness, a diagnosable mental illness. So that's what you're looking at. I mean, and these guys are difficult. They don't do well. Some of them actually do better in the regimented systems that we have for jails and in the prisons, but a lot of them do not, and especially with the isolation, if they're in a cell 23 hours a day and they come out for shower and rec, a lot of these guys don't do well at all over time in that situation. So we really have to monitor them more closely. That was all part of our IPAS lawsuit. And we're doing all of those things now, and we're measuring, we're kind of keeping score to see a couple, 2-3 years down the road if it makes a big difference. As I said, we have our stabilization units. Newcastle Correctional Facility is our unit for our most ill offenders. There are a lot of mentally ill offenders at the Newcastle unit who will probably never progress out of that unit. They'll be there, and some of them will have to probably look at commitment to a state hospital when they get out. But that's where our most mentally ill offenders go, to Newcastle. We have our most staff there. We have probably more psychologists, psychiatrists there because they're just the more demanding type of offenders. And then at Wabash Valley, we have a special needs unit that is a step-down unit from Newcastle. If they can progress out of Newcastle, they can go to the special needs unit at Wabash Valley, or they may go to the IRT unit at Pendleton. Both of those units are similar in programming. It's another step. They get more freedoms, they get more privileges, they get more responsibilities, and it's just kind of a transition to get them back to the general population. And then, as I said, we developed in the last few years SNAP units. They're called, they're special need, they're reacclimation units basically. There's 7 of them across the state. And those are in our general population facilities. And it's just another layer that we created for those guys who are transitioning back to population, or maybe guys in your general population that may not be mentally ill, but maybe they have, maybe they are in a wheelchair, or maybe they're a little bit older, or anything that would make them or put them on the fringe of the prison population and make them vulnerable. We can put them in these SNAP units, and they're general population units. They still go out to rec. They still go to the same chow hall with everybody else. They may have a job. We're trying to develop mentoring programs where guys can mentor them even on their jobs, just kind of so they're not out there alone. We have 7 of those across the state, and those seem to be working really well, and it helps the wardens out because those are the types of guys who usually end up being assaulted, or they need protective custody, or they're causing other issues. A lot of them will even intentionally get themselves to a segregated unit so they can be in a cell by themselves where they feel safe, and we'll talk a little bit about how much of that goes on as well as I go. Those are the 4 mental health units. We do have one at the women's unit as well, at the Indiana Women's Prison. And it is the same type of a setup, only at the women's unit there's a lot more freedom there. They're not in their cells near as much as they are at the other units. So the women are kind of out and about. They're participating in groups. And it's all about physical plant. We would do it that way at all of them, but the physical plant is just more accepting to that type of thing at the Indiana Women's Prison. But the idea is the same. Get them stabilized, get them some group counseling, give them some skills with the idea of eventually getting them back to the general population. I talked about Newcastle already. I told you I didn't follow this very closely, but at the SNU at the Indiana Reformatory. And we have the potential of putting about close to 400 guys in the unit at the Reformatory. All in all, we've probably got about 600 guys in the mental health programming in the 4 inpatient units. Or I'm sorry, about 400. We have the capability of 600. We have a couple hundred open beds and that's actually a good thing because the whole idea of our program is to get them out, to transition them out. So when you look at what that should look like, if we're doing our job, there should be some empty beds. Of course, empty beds are expensive, and especially in a maximum security prison, they're the most valuable beds that we have. So we always do a daily balancing act of how do we get those beds filled without just putting everybody in there because they have a depression or something like that. We want to keep them as independent as possible. The SNAP units were kind of started by Warden Stan Knight at the Indiana State Farm several years ago, and it was an initiative he took on his own. And he really found that by putting guys on the fringe of the population in a special needs unit and giving them even minimal group counseling, support type counseling on a weekly basis, We don't have mental health staff that are on those units full-time, but he found that it really reduced his numbers of guys needing to go to restricted housing units. He found that it cut down on a lot of the protective custody requests, and in general cut down on some of the violence in his facilities. So he actually ran it for a couple of years, and I went and took a look at it, and he did a good job of keeping track of the guys coming in and out and the statistics. And so it was good enough that we thought it was worthwhile of recreating those at 6 or 7 other places around the state, and we've now done that. And the guys there seem to do pretty well. Everyone's a little bit different, again, because of physical plant. I mean, if you go to the Indiana State Prison, where, the year it opened, Abe Lincoln was still our president, that unit looks different than the Indiana Youth Center, or the Plainfield Correctional Facility, as it's called now, which is quite a bit newer. So everyone, I left it to the wardens. This is the basic thing that these units were for, but I left them the flexibility to be able to use them to the best advantage of their own facility. So every one of them's a little bit different, and yet at their core, they're all the same. One of the biggest problems that we run into with the discipline of offenders with mental health issues is trying to figure out, did they do whatever they did because of their mental illness, or did they do whatever they did thinking they could use their mental illness as an excuse to not be held accountable for it? And when we talk about our toughest daily challenge for me and everybody else in the mental health field is making those decisions every day of whether or not a guy is truly mentally ill, or whether he's partly mentally ill, but he's antisocial, he's got personality disorder, he's got other disorders, he's using drugs inside the prison. We have to try to weed through all that, every single incident that occurs, and try to figure out which is it that caused this behavior, whether it be an assaultive behavior or whether it be a suicide attempt. We've looked at the cells in the previous presentation, and we talked about having angled stuff and breakaway hooks and things like that. So we have to figure out, is this person really mentally ill, or are they just trying to play the system? Because in our lawsuit, we made these rules that we weren't going to put seriously mentally ill guys in long-term restricted housing anymore. We weren't going to do that. We're going to say that they can only be there no more than 30 days. And then we have to figure out on accountability levels whether or not the behavior was caused by their mental illness, or whether it was, they should be held fully accountable. Then we have to figure out, okay, if after 30 days, if it was a mental health issue, do they need to go in a mental health treatment unit? Do they need to go in a SNAP unit? Do they need to, every day with every guy, we have to go through this whole process to try to figure out what was the motivation behind the behavior. So our disciplinary code, what we do now is for anything other than a major offense, if a guy has an identified mental health issue, before a decision is made on his guilt or innocence of his conduct violation, the mental health staff is consulted as to whether or not their professional opinion is whether or not the behavior was caused by his illness, or whether or not it was just him being a good union inmate. So that process is built in as part of the lawsuit, because what was happening is a lot of these guys were just building up and stacking up all this time. Some of them had 10, 15 years of segregated housing time, and they only had 5 years of total time to do on their sentence. So you would have guys with serious mental illness being held in the most restricted housing, isolated by themselves, even though there's plenty of yelling back and forth, and we all know what that's about. But we ended up with all of these guys, and I have certain beliefs about if I were an inmate and if I were running scared, and I could just slap an officer on the arm and go to SEG for 6 months and be in a cell by myself where I could sleep at night and know I'm safe, that's not mentally ill. That's pretty logical to me. I mean, that's pretty logical thinking on my part. So we're constantly fighting that. You know, does an inmate cut his wrist because he's really wanting to die, or does he cut his wrist because he knows that mental health has to come in and remove him from that area and put him somewhere where at least we have to, you know, for a few weeks at least, to figure out whether or not he's really suicidal or not. So the rules that we put into place for their own good, of course, are being used to manipulate us for the bad. You know, an inmate thinks he can do anything he wants now because I have a depression diagnosis, and you can't keep me in restricted housing for more than 30 days. And they'll tell you, I mean, they read the lawsuit to you. I mean, they know it as well as anybody. So we do have some built-in things to manage those guys. We have danger exceptions, you know, that we can keep them in there longer than 30 days if we have to. But the key is that we had to develop some kind of a treatment program for them. We couldn't just put them in there and leave them go for that long, you know, period of time, 6 months or a year without any treatment. So as you know, that is a difficult thing too, especially if those of you work in, is there anybody else here that works in prisons, or is it pretty much counties? Okay. So the segregated units are even less likely to have any treatment space than the regular prison units. So that's been a hard thing to overcome, but if there's a will, there's a way, and we've managed to do it. We try to get them out for at least 10 hours a week for therapeutic time. So that's not that's not going in the rec yard and shooting a basketball, or that's not when he gets a visit and he spends an hour in a visitation room. None of that counts. It's 10 hours out of cell for therapeutic time that we're providing programming for that offender. That's hard to do. We struggle with it every day, but we've figured out ways to where we can at least offer it. And to be honest with you, a lot of the offenders don't want it. They just leave me alone. Get away from me. The IPAS settlement, we agreed with the ICLU about 4 years ago now, 3.5, that we would do all of these things. And the court, of course, supervises the settlement for 3 years. We just recently called in an expert because we're at the end of our 3-year supervisory period with the court. We just called in an expert from Arizona. He was agreed to by us and the ICLU to come in and examine our inpatient mental health programming and examine our policies and procedures that have been set up for us to be in compliance with the IPAS lawsuit. And he was here for a full week, visited quite a few of our facilities, all of our mental health units, and I haven't gotten the written report back, but the verbal debriefing when he left was very, very positive. He told the ICLU that not only is Indiana complying with the IPAS agreement, that we're actually gone way beyond what the requirements are in providing treatment. So that was nice to have somebody come in from the outside that you know wasn't me looking at it or wasn't a lawyer looking at it. It was somebody coming in from the outside with fresh eyes and who has seen what's going on in other states to come in and give us that kind of a praise. So. And these are some of the specifics of the IPAS agreement. They can certainly consent to stay in restricted housing if they want to stay there, if they feel safe. To me, that's not much different than protective custody. And we try very hard in the facilities not to grant a lot of protective custody because everybody, you know, protective custody is difficult to run because you just never, how do you keep a guy safe from everybody in a prison setting? It's pretty hard to do. So we really discourage protective custody. We try to give them orientation when they come in. Don't get in debt, don't sell drugs, don't use drugs, don't steal, don't rent a cell phone from somebody, don't do all of these things that get you in trouble. So we at least try to do that, because what we've seen with our suicide attempts is that about 80% or so of the suicide attempts are motivated by the person scared because they're running from a gang and they're in debt, and they knew that if they did A, we would have to do B, and if we did B, they would be safe at least for a couple of weeks. So it's a waste of a lot of time. You can't ignore it. You have to treat every cut, whether it's on top of the forearm or whether it's to the top of the thigh or an unlikely place that somebody's not going to die from a cut like that. You have to treat every one of them the same, because the moment you don't, something's going to go sideways, and then you're going to have difficulty answering as to why you didn't step up and go through your process. So we treat everyone the same way, the best we can. And we've had we've had 6 suicides this year, which is a lot. Because last year I think we had 2 in the entire state inside the prison system. This year we've had 6, and it's only July. So, but just about every one of those that we look through are, because we do an extensive review anytime someone does commit suicide to try to learn what, did we miss something? And a lot of these guys had no mental health diagnoses. They had no history of harming themselves, so they don't have any reason to be, on our radar. But these are guys that are maybe 38, 39 years old and still have 100 years to do. So they just lose hope. It's not always just the loss of a family member or an unexpected death of a child. I mean, when we find out about these things, of course, we automatically put them on suicide watch and give them a cooling down period. But some of the guys that have committed suicide this year just were not on our radar and didn't give us any indications at all. And those are truly the ones that are the most dangerous in terms of really harming themselves. The guy that waits for the officer to come down to a cell door and says, hey, I'm going to kill myself, and does it right in front of the officer, obviously, that's more of a cry for help than it is an actual suicide attempt. Most of our guys that do, we're talking about the fixtures in the cells, most of the guys that do successfully kill themselves hang themselves. So whether it be I've seen it done a lot of different ways, but most of them occur in our older prisons that actually have conduits in the cell that it's easy to wrap a sheet around, or there's vents, or there's old TV stands that aren't designed in the last 50, 60 years. So that's the most successful way that they get it done. Occasionally we get a guy who cuts himself, but for the most part, when we have a suicide, it tends to be hanging. So keep that in mind in your design. I know you already think about it, and when you're looking to purchase a cell, but it doesn't take much to be able to strap a sheet or a T-shirt or whatever it might be around something, and even we've even had guys do it sitting on the floor from their bed frame. If there's a place attached to the bed frame, they just lean forward. I mean, it doesn't take much, but those are the guys that are determined, and no matter how hard we try, you're not going to stop every one of them. If a guy or a gal wants to get it done, they'll get it done. As I said, the courts don't care about your limited amount of staff or your space or anything like that. So we had to hire a lot more mental health staff, for sure. We have a great partnership with Wexford Health of Indiana. And we provided quite a few more psychologists and master's level people, and then they actually help us get online with the telehealth so that we could get our psychiatry on. Even though we can't find people to hire and have on full time, we are able to hire them for a certain amount of hours to get on a camera and talk to the inmates on the camera. Guys that do go to restricted housing and have disciplinary seg time, if we take them out, if they have a serious mental illness, we take them out and put them in a mental health unit for a while, say 6 months, their disciplinary segregation time continues to run while they're in the mental health unit. So that when they get out of the mental health unit, they just don't go right back to the restricted housing for a year and undo everything that we just got accomplished. There's all kinds of little checks and balances we have. Anytime anybody goes to a restricted housing unit, mental health has to see them within 72 hours to determine if they have a mental illness or if they're seriously mentally ill. So that's very time consuming. You know, the Indiana State Prison has over 400 restricted housing unit cells by itself. So every time somebody goes in one of those cells, a mental health staff person has, within 72 hours, has to sit down and evaluate that person. So this is actually I use for training new staff. One of the other important things that we've done is we've kind of always wanted to hand select the officers that work in our mental health units, because there are some people that just don't want anything to do with that. And any of you who've have any background in mental health, you know, if you do, you know that 8 hours of good work in mental health can be destroyed in 2 minutes if you got the wrong staff member when that person goes back to a housing unit. So we try to handpick the people who actually want to work with mental health patients, and then we put them through 40 hours of extra training dealing with the basics of mental health and what to look for and how you interact with a person with a mental illness, so that we're not constantly fighting our own forces and trying to help these guys out. They call that the Certified Treatment Specialist training, and if any of you in the county jails would be interested in what that training looks like, I can certainly send you the training guidelines for that. But that helps anytime there's a lawsuit or there's any national accreditation or anything like that. That really helps, that you can say my officers that work that unit have been through 40 hours of specialized training just to work with these offenders. Okay?
Thank you, sir. Any questions?
Hold on, one question over here.
Mark?
Yes.
So this is a live stream question. What is the leading factor of suicide attempts?
Well, as I said, I find that probably about 80 to 85 of the suicidal threats and gestures, 85%, are due to guys running for help, and we'll often find out that, hey, they just got denied PC by with the investigators, then so 20 minutes later they cut the wrist. So there's lots of criminal activity that continues to go on inside the prison, and as I said, drugs, cell phones, gambling, prostitution, all of the things that you hear about on the news every night, they still go on inside the prisons. And people that get themselves in debt are usually the ones we see doing the suicide attempts, because they get so fearful that the gangs are going to kill them. That we even had one guy he successfully killed himself about 6 years ago. He, in his note, said that I was in big time debt to the gangs and they were going to kill me, and he said I wasn't going to. He said if I'm going to die, I'm going to die on my control and do it the way I want to go, instead of being. So I would say that those criminal activities that get inmates in debt, that leads to as many suicide attempts as anything.
Thank you.
Question?
Question?
You didn't touch on juvenile population much. Do you see an increase in that area as well?
Well, in Indiana, our juvenile population is actually, the last few years, has been down pretty low. In fact, we've even consolidated a couple of our facilities because we didn't need them anymore. But we provide full mental health services, and everything that we talked about on the adult side, we do with the juveniles as well. Now, it may be done a little differently, and it may be done with more intensity. The juvenile per diem is about 3 to 4 times what the adult per diem is. So, and the reason for that is because all the program staff, the psychiatrists, the extra psychiatrists, psychologists, and the mental health folks, the teachers, and all of that. So, you know, your juvenile per diem might be around $200 a day per inmate, whereas our adult population is about 56. So, but they get all of those same services, and probably with more intensity.